Hi, everybody. I see some of my students that are in 103, and I feel bad because you've had to see me in class today, and maybe even in a presentation earlier, and now this. So you're going to be really sick of me by the end of the day, but oh well. Okay, so I wanted to really thank the associated students for putting this together and for engaging the social sciences division. You know, we wanted to do this kind of as a way to provide support to the students, but also to kind of provide information. And Levon Marashlian had done a presentation on Tuesday that was wonderful in kind of providing the history of the conflict. And so what I wanted to do was really focus on kind of the context of the conflict in the way we approach it in international relations. And this is primarily to give you, as an audience, information about really, you know, the context in which this is occurring, the tools and the kind of institutions that are at the disposal of the different actors, the different groups that are engaged in this conflict, and then get you to really think critically about the solutions and how, in many ways, hard that is to accomplish, okay? So it's gonna be kind of heavy on international relations and not as case specific, but I've asked Dr. Marashlian at the end to help me take questions. And so I can answer those questions really from a, you know, a discipline specific look at international relations and political science in general. And then Dr. Marashlian has more of the history and specifics of the case. So that's kind of how I'm organizing it. I hope you guys have questions. I'm looking forward to taking your questions. And if you have them, again, put them in the chat and we're going to catalog them and then we'll answer them. And so with that said, I'm going to go ahead and start, and I'm going to screen share, and hopefully you'll be able to see it on my screen. Me and Zoom have a very conflicted relationship, so. Okay, can you guys see that and hear me? Yeah? Yes, okay. All right, so what we really wanna do is kind of place the conflict in kind of a broader international relations perspective. So there's a few things that we always start with as premises in international relations. We use the term on our campus, world politics. It's the same thing. It's just the engagement of countries. And from a language perspective, I'm going to use the term state. And I don't mean like Mississippi, I mean country. But in international relations, we refer to them as states. And so I just want to clarify that from a linguistic standpoint so that it's clear for everybody. So there's a few kind of foundations for international relations. And the first one is that we assume in international relations that the international system is what we call anarchic, that there is no world government. We don't have like a supranational government that establishes rules that states give up their power to and then agree to be bound by it, right? Like, so there's no equivalent to the United States government or the state of California government for the entire world. So that's a really important starting point, because what it means is that really states, again, this means countries, are left to have to resolve their own disputes, right? They have to kind of devise structures, institutions, organizations to try to resolve these disputes. But at the end of the day, they don't have anybody that can really instruct them and kind of punish states effectively to do it. So keeping those kind of foundational things in mind is important. So the closest thing we have to a world government is the United Nations. And I'm gonna stop you there and say it's not a world government. It is a membership organization where countries, states join it. They agree to be bound by the charter, right? But the organization itself is set up to not have a tremendous amount of power, okay? And that's the way they like it, right? The United Nations is created out of World War II. It's the goal of it is to prevent another world war. But simultaneously, it's not given the tools to really effectively require states to abide by its rules or by the resolutions it passes and things like that. So keeping in mind that this is the best we have, but it's weak intentionally, okay? So the United Nations is really set up to resolve disputes, but what we use this term Pacific, right? So if you know the Pacific Ocean, it's kind of calm, right? And so the idea is that the United Nations really emphasizes Pacific settlements of dispute. All that means is no war. Like that's war ultimately becomes, or the use of force becomes a last resort. And so this is the kind of general parameter in which the conflict is occurring. And the biggest challenge to effectively dealing with conflicts, because again, states have to resolve their own disputes. They can turn to the UN. The UN ultimately relies on states to comply, right? The United Nations really does not have the tools to effectively force states to behave. So you have to get states to comply, and there are ways to do that, but it's really difficult, okay? And the reason that it's difficult is kind of the first point that I'm going to get into. So there's two kind of competing questions that I'm going to try to explain, not give an answer to, but kind of give you the idea behind it, the kind of the constraints that we have in international relations. So the first one is how are oh God, that's horrible. I have a typo on the first one. How are territorial disputes settled? And what I mean by a territorial dispute is if two states or two entities both want the same territory, how do we resolve that? Okay. And then the second one is, when should self-determination be permitted? And self-determination is the right of a group of people to basically form their own independent state and live happily ever after. Okay. So when does international law allow self-determination to be permitted? So then once we kind of examine the rules about this, then we want to look at what the tools are available to the UN, and then presuming that the UN isn't going to be particularly effective, are there other tools that are available to resolve the conflict? Okay, so that kind of gives you a little bit of an idea of how I'm going to approach this. So the first question about how are territorial disputes settled, we want to think about really the historical foundation of international law. So those of you guys that have taken Political Science 103, you know, I always harp on this, right? 1648, it's the magic date. It's the signing of an international peace treaty in Europe that establishes kind of modern international relations. And the really kind of key piece of this is sovereignty. And the word sovereignty basically means that states can do whatever they want inside their own borders. They have ultimate authority over themselves within the boundaries of their state. They can decide how they basically want to treat their people. They can decide what their laws should look like. And no other state can infringe upon that. And this is basically done in 1648 because you have a series of moral wars where there's these monarchs are invading each other, there's religious persecution, and they basically come to the table and they say, hey, okay, every state is sovereign, every state gets to do what they want, how they want to treat their people, and nobody's going to invade anybody anymore. This becomes the kind of cornerstone of modern international law that's going to regulate kind of state behavior and how states can meddle in the affairs of other states. All right. The other kind of assumptions that are made with this treaty is that they're entitled to territorial integrity. And that's a concept that means that if I have a border around, that I identify, the international community recognizes those are my borders, that I am entitled to maintain that and nobody can take territory from me. Okay. And I always joke, and this is going to fall flat because my 103 class has already heard it with it, like the cartography division of the United Nations is the most powerful entity on earth because they get to draw the lines on a map, and whatever their map says is kind of the real map, right? But we know that's not true, and we know that there's a lot of history behind this. We know that there's a lot of things that can actually, in real life alter where the borders are. But the map is kind of defines the territorial integrity, and it defines where that state has sovereignty over. And then kind of contingent upon, or based in this idea of sovereignty, is that there's non-interference in domestic conflicts. And so if I have sovereignty, I basically can mistreat my people. I can persecute religious minorities. I can do whatever I want. And there's the Treaty of Westphalia establishes non-interference. And so, I always use the analogy that it's like, or the example of it's like an opaque pool ball, like a billiard ball. You can't see what's going on in there. And that's essentially the sovereignty that's established. And it becomes the foundation for modern international law that's going to dictate, like, basically how you settle territorial disputes and how much power states have within their own borders. Okay, so from that flows some of these other ideas that infringement on the territory of another state is forbidden. And this is very, very clearly established in most large pieces of international law, whether those are treaties, they're protocols, conventions, anything that discusses states and state sovereignty is going to say you can't infringe, which means you can't try to take territory from another state, you can't invade another state, you can't take resources from another state. nothing like that, okay? And the only use of force that's permitted is in self-defense, right? So this is kind of like an international law foundation. It starts in the 1640s, and then it's going to be reinforced in the United Nations Charter, is that force is not permissible unless you are being attacked, okay? I'll give you two examples to kind of illustrate the difference here, which is that the Gulf War, the Iraq War in 1991, was the invasion of Iraq into Kuwait. And this was a very clear example of one state invading another state's territory. And so under international law, under the UN Charter, the United Nations Security Council could pass a resolution. It could give the various countries the ability to use their militaries to go in and basically push Iraq out. All right. Fast forward to 2003, there is not any kind of territorial inroads, right? Nobody is invading the United States. And the United Nations, even though this is all about whether Iraq has weapons of mass destruction, the United States makes its case. The UN Security Council passes a resolution. That resolution is only dealing with whether Iraq has inspections of their weapons of mass destruction program. The International Atomic Energy Agency confirms they do not, in fact, have this. They are not making inroads. And the United States decides to move forward with this, the invasion in Iraq in March 2003, on the basis of preemption. What's the doctrine of preemption, which is, I'm not being attacked, but I think it's imminent, and so I'm going to pre-attack them, right? And I'm going to go and I'm going to invade their territory before they attack me. And so this is, in kind of 2003 parlance, it was called the Bush Doctrine, which is this doctrine of preemption. And it basically turned all of the idea of use of force in the United Nations on its head, because it was saying, okay, this is not a permissible violation of territorial integrity for the United States to invade Iraq. They're claiming preemption. That's not something we agree with. And so the United Nations didn't condone it. And the United States kind of hobbled together a coalition of countries to go in, but it was in kind of direct violation of what had been established in international law prior to that. So what we want to reinforce here is that there is complete international legal protection for states to defend themselves against inroads on their territory. Where it gets difficult, right, is can a state justify that they are having violations into their territory? Like, what's really happening there? And that's where it becomes problematic. Okay, so in terms of the United Nations response, these are just general ways the United Nations would respond. These are not case specific to what's happening between Azerbaijan and Armenia in Nagorno-Karabakh right now, okay? But the first thing would be that, I should back up and I should say that all of this that I'm gonna talk about right now is contingent upon somebody getting the United Nations to pay attention to it. And what I mean by that is, it would be really typical for a state, a country, to go to the United Nations and complain, right? And it would be less typical for a non-state actor, a subnational actor, to do that. And so, one of the things the United Nations is set up really well to deal with is two countries that have a conflict. But when it's non-state actors, when it is a group, right, when it's a paramilitary group that's not associated with a government, it's a little bit more difficult. And so we have an organization that's really based on kind of countries dealing with each other and not all these other civil conflicts that we see around the world. But that being said, the United Nations first response is always going to be diplomacy. I mentioned Pacific settlement of disputes. We call this peacemaking. This is bringing two parties together, having having summits, having talks, trying to get them to come to some kind of resolution. Now, one thing that's going on right now is that the United Nations has basically given deference to the Minsk group, which I'll get into a little bit later. But had that not been the case, where they were giving this kind of peacemaking role over to somebody else, the United Nations would be the appropriate place for that to happen. This is going to revolve then investigations and fact-finding missions. And so this is going to require that some entity, okay, and I'm being vague there, right, because it could be the United Nations, but it's some legitimate entity that is trusted by both sides, is able to go in, do a fact-finding mission, do investigations, interview people, gather evidence, and bring it back, okay? And so that's like a really critical piece of this. And then if that is the case, and there is a recognition that there has been a violation of territorial integrity or something like akin to that, then it's going to be referred to the Security Council. And so the Security Council is the part of the United Nations that basically has responsibility for dealing with anything that is related to peace and security. So there are other parts of the United Nations that deal with, you know, environmental issues, food, health, stuff like that. The Security Council is going to deal with peace and security. And so if there is a fact-finding mission and investigations that demonstrate that, yes, there is a legitimate conflict here, there was a violation of territorial integrity, then it's going to be, sorry, I think that's, you can hear my dog, then it's going to be referred to the Security Council. And the Security Council has a few tools at its disposal. So the first would be, again, not force. The first is negative sanctions. I mean, I guess I could say first would be positive sanctions. And what I mean by positive sanctions is trying to almost give a carrot to the party that is violating the territorial integrity and say, okay, like here, we're gonna get you to do what we want by providing you an incentive. That's called a positive sanction. If that doesn't work, then you use the stick, right? So if you've ever heard of the example of the carrot and the stick, so then we're gonna use the stick and we're gonna kind of force them to do what we want. And so the UN Charter gives the Security Council the power to use sanctions, negative sanctions, which are to try to change the incentive of the country that has, you know, gone in and violated the territorial integrity of the other state. But what it requires is a documented, valid threat to peace, breach of peace, or act of aggression, okay? And so that's the first step. And then the second one, and we call that Chapter 6, because that's the part of the charter it comes from. Then use of force, which would be a last resort, is this requires the same requirements of breach of peace, etc., but it directs the use of force. And it's important to point out that the United Nations does not have its own standing military. That was intentionally done when the United Nations was formed. There were discussions about it, but nobody wanted to have this kind of independent military force out there. And so instead what they did was they said that member states would contribute their militaries in order to carry out a use of force, but it barely ever happens, okay? All right, so some other UN options, and I'll get to kind of the biggest problem with the United Nations as the solution right now. So another one would be peacekeeping forces, which would basically be identifying that there's a conflict. We call this Chapter 6.5 kind of as a joke because it's not in there, but it's become the more typical use of force by the UN is to go in and deal with a civil war or deal with like an on the ground conflict, and basically just keep the peace. You keep you keep the civilians safe, you defend them, but it's not an offensive military force. They actually can't shoot unless shot upon, which makes them very vulnerable. But again, they're there to protect civilians, and so it's not an effective solution. It just will help minimize casualties if you have that happen. We have successful examples of this in like Rwanda, well, sort of successful in Rwanda, and there was a lot of civilian casualty, but it wasn't an example. We have it in Sudan, in the partitioning of South and North Sudan. We see it in Congo. So a lot of places in sub-Saharan Africa where there is this kind of infighting at a subnational level, we see peacekeeping forces are fairly effective, but they don't resolve the situation. They just keep the civilians safe. So I mentioned that the United Nations does not have its own military force, and it relies on member states. But more and more what we see the United Nations doing is relying on other organizations to do it for them, to employ the force. So for instance, we see the use of NATO. We saw NATO in the mid-1990s was very effective at kind of ending the Balkans conflict. We have seen the use of the African Union, which is an international organization of member states in sub-Saharan Africa. And they've been very effective in dealing with using their military in sub-Saharan African conflicts. So on a much more kind of local level. And then the Organization of American States has also been effective in dealing primarily with issues related to paramilitary groups, drug cartels in South and Central America. But this is kind of outsourcing the use of force because the United Nations itself doesn't have that. So, you know, if you're talking about resolving a conflict, you want to try to do it in the most effective way, but also in a way that that in some cases localizes the use of force, and it doesn't draw in a bunch of outside actors. Okay, so we can talk all day about the UN, but at the end of it, the biggest problem is it all hinges on the veto. And the way that the United Nations is set up is because it was created by primarily the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and the United States after World War II, it was set up to protect their interests as well. So the goal was to keep the peace and not have World War II or World War III. But it was also set up to kind of make sure that the organization would never go against the interests of the founding countries. And so the Security Council that I mentioned is set up with veto, and there's 5 countries that have the veto. So China, France, the United Kingdom, Russia, and the United States. They all have a veto. And basically what that means is if one of them doesn't agree with an action being taken by the Security Council, they can kill it. So in the case that we're talking about right now with Karabakh, Russia has a veto. So any action that the Security Council wanted to take, if they could ever come to some kind of agreement on what that action should be, is probably dead on arrival, because unless Russia is willing to go along with it, they can veto it. So they can veto use of force. They can veto even the ability to do any kind of Pacific settlement investigations, summits, anything like that. So this is a weakness of the UN, and that's why I think there's, it's been deferred to other organizations, and in part it's because you probably would have a form of stalemate if the UN was to get involved actively. So that's just something to keep in mind as a weakness of the organization. Okay, the other UN option is to petition the International Court of Justice. The International Court of Justice is a main body of the UN, and it has the ability to hear cases that are disputes between 2 states, but it has to be brought by a member state of the United Nations. And so, for instance, in this case, Armenia could bring it against Azerbaijan or vice versa, but it would have to be a member state of the United Nations. The International Court of Justice is not set up to be particularly successful, and in many cases, states have the ability to just say, we don't care, we're not going to abide by it, right? Again, it's designed to not be particularly effective. So that's another option in the UN, but probably wouldn't be very successful, okay? Okay, let me move on then to the second question. Let me see what my time is looking like. Okay. So the other question is, when should self-determination be permitted? And again, self-determination really means that you have a group of people that want to be separate. They want to be by themselves. They want to have their own state and be on their own. Okay. And so the question is, based on the way we apply international law, when should this be permitted? I just basically told you this. But what the articles in the charter that relate to this say is they basically say that yes, a people, and I put that in quotes for a reason, can declare independence and become a new state. That's what it says. And this is the language from the charter. It says that the respect for the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples is the basis for peaceful and friendly relations among the nations. Okay, so there's very wonky international legal scholars that debate this all the time, and they debate about whether this really was something that was rooted in the kind of decolonization that was taking place after 1945, or if it applies generally. Okay, post 1945, most of the self-determination was taking place in sub-Saharan Africa and parts of Asia, where you had these newly independent post-colonial states that were forming, and even out of that, you had additional states that were separating from those new states, right? And all this was based on kind of this idea that you had a group of people that shared a commonality that wanted to be separate. It's been more broadly, applied beyond just post-colonial situations, but not very often. In fact, I could kind of argue that based on the way that the international community has responded to self-determination, it suggests that it's not well supported by the international community. And so I gave you 3 examples here of Catalonia, which is a region that wanted to separate, actually voted to separate from Spain. Kurdistan, which is composed of the Kurdish population, primarily between Turkey, Syria, and Iraq. Hold on one second. Can you guys hear that? Okay, hold on one sec. Sorry. Okay, sorry, my dog was going crazy. Okay, and then, so Kurdistan, same thing, right? This is a group that the Kurds would like to have their own state, and they've been denied at every turn. And then Scotland. And Scotland hadn't actively sought this. It was a kind of moving in that direction. And both in Catalonia and Scotland's case, you had real pushback from, for instance, the European Union, where they just said, look, you can declare independence, but we're not going to let you into the European Union. We're not going to trade with you, right? And so it appears that they're not going to get the recognition and support from other states or international organizations. And so there's a big downside for them to declare their independence. That said, again, it's not impossible. It's just that it's a little bit of an uphill climb in terms of the perception of the international community as to whether it's okay or not. Okay. So the thing that we always look at to figure out if a entity is a state is what's called the 1933 Montevideo Convention, and it establishes this kind of four-pronged test where we say, okay, does this entity have these four things? And if it does, then it's an independent state that would be recognized, given a spot on the map at the UN and all that stuff, a membership in the United Nations. And so in order to be kind of a legal independent state, it needs to have defined borders, what we referred to before as territorial integrity. It has to be basically able to point to borders and like lines that are clearly identified as its own, okay? It has to have a stable population. It has to have a group of people that aren't transient. They don't move in and out, they're there, right? And it helps if there's a long history. You have to have people that there's a government that has allegiance from the people that are there, right? So you can kind of see how this is all building on each part of it. And then there has to be, and this is like the really critical one, is it has to have recognition by other states. And it's there because what it says is, look, in order for you to be able to kind of conduct yourself as a state, trade, engage in diplomatic relations, like you have to have other states being willing to recognize you as legitimate. And that's where, when you get back to those examples of like Catalonia, Kurdistan, Scotland, that was a missing piece, right? Is that other states weren't willing to recognize them as independent, which is going to really hurt them as being a viable independent state. Those are kind of the technical requirements that if we were talking about whether you could have Karabakh could be independent, it would have to meet that criteria. And there are plenty of articles out there that will suggest that it does. And I'm not contesting that. I'm just saying that that's what it would have to meet. And then we have to look at the ability to secede, right? Like, what are the legal parameters for secession to look like? So what's really interesting is this is going to come in direct conflict with sovereignty. It's going to come in direct conflict to this notion that territorial integrity is the paramount value of international law. And this is primarily a shift that has taken place post-World War II, primarily due to the Holocaust. And the reason I say that is because in the 1910s and 20s, you begin to see the development of human rights law, international law that has an emphasis on human rights. It begins with what's called the Geneva Conventions, which is a series of international treaties and laws that states join that basically identify the rules of war. This is what you can and can't do. This is how you have to treat civilians. This is how you have to treat POWs. You have to differentiate between civilians and military personnel. And all of that is focused really on behavior in war, but it really ramps up with the Holocaust. And there's this recognition that gross violations of human rights have to be dealt with, and that you can't hide inside that pool ball. You can't hide inside there and go, we can treat our people however we want. The international community goes, man, we blew it with the Holocaust. And they say, we've got to make sure that we're not letting states grossly violate the rights of their people. And we're going to create some very slow changing, parameters for when we can actually, protect the human rights of the people inside those states. What this basically does is it says that sovereignty is no longer absolute and unqualified, and that you can take into consideration how governments are treating their people. It's not, trust me, it's not fully developed, right? I mean, this is still, you ask any authoritarian leader if they can treat their people however they want, and they'll tell you yes, right? But slowly we're shifting to acknowledge that there's a change in whether sovereignty is absolute, right? So this is a new term, not new, but I'd say in the last like 20 years that we start to see, which is a concept called remedial secession. So secession is to secede, which is to separate. And so if we talk about self-determination, what we're talking about is a group of people They want to be separate, they want to secede, and they want to form their own state, okay? Remedial secession is a relatively new concept. And what this says is secession is legitimate if there are conditions that justify it as a last resort, okay? So it's a remedy of last resort. You've tried everything else and you still can't, you can't correct the situation. So secession is permissible as a last resort. And so what international legal scholars have tried to do is kind of create like a test, right? Like these are the things that have to be met in order for secession to be okay. And so there are established conditions, and they say, okay, so basically it has to be the severe, long-lasting refusal of internal self-determination and or systemic, severe, and massive human rights violations. The internal self-determination means that you have a group of people that share kind of a common culture, and they're being denied that, and they're not being given kind of this like autonomy, this ability to kind of be themselves. And then that's also a long kind of history, again, of these massive human rights violations. These are highly subjective terms, right? What a massive human rights violation is to an authoritarian versus a democracy is going to be very different. But again, it's about kind of identifying this as a long-term problem. The second one is that there isn't any kind of internal viable remedy or feasible alternative to solve the conflict. So we've tried everything. Again, it's a last resort. We're gonna try the talks. We're gonna try all this, and it's not working. And then the third one is the really important one because it's the one on which there have been successful cases, which is that the people that want to secede, and again, I put that kind of in quotes, right? They have to possess a common, I'll let you read all that, right? But basically, they have to be a recognized independent people that is very, very distinct from the country that they're seceding from, right? This isn't just a group of people that are unhappy with the government. This is a group that is completely different and is then also being subjected to tremendous human rights violations, probably largely due in part to the fact that they're different than the country that they're seceding from, okay? And we see this all the time with minority populations. And so the question is, where is that breaking point at which they should be allowed to secede and be on their own, okay? And again, it's not a perfect system, and the international community is still trying to kind of grapple with it. This is kind of the key, right? Is that, like we said before, remedial secession requires validation and definition. It really requires that there is a robust meeting of that three-pronged criteria to basically justify to the international community that secession is legitimate. I use the term because it's kind of an easy way to think of it, right? But non-governmental organizations. So if we think about groups like, these are private organizations that work on some issue, right? And so if we think about human rights organizations like Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch, one of the things they're really good at is what we call naming and shaming, which is going into a country, observing human rights violations, documenting them, and then shaming, right? And drawing attention to it. And one of the things that the United Nations has done is that they have introduced what's called consultative status, which just means that non-governmental organizations can consult, they can be brought in as experts and provide that documentation, provide that kind of independent validation of human rights abuses. And they're very valuable because you're not having to rely on a state to document another state, or to, a government to say, well, of course we're violating our people's rights. So they're independent of any state, and that gives them a lot of autonomy, and it allows them to really draw attention and try to provide that information to the international community to resolve the situation. So then the last part of this that's probably tough, right, is that you've got to, oh, sorry, I added that and I said it, about the non-governmental organizations, is that other states have to recognize them. They have to recognize the people that are seceding. And this is where the legitimacy comes from. It's one thing if, one other state recognizes this. It really requires multiple states to recognize it. We call this, in international relations, we call it a cascade, which is, if you think of it as like on a lever, right? Like a seesaw. And you imagine like one state recognizes that the people as independent, a couple more it tips, right? And that's a cascade. And so what it requires then is this external recognition. We haven't seen that. I mentioned Catalonia, I mentioned Scotland, I mentioned Kurdistan. There hasn't been that. One good example is Kosovo. And we use this as an example of a successful remedial secession because they voted to secede, and it was upheld as legitimate, right? But one of the reasons it was upheld as legitimate, and I think this is kind of interesting, especially in light of thinking about Karabakh, is the distinction that was made by the International Court of Justice that ultimately was who heard this case about whether this independence vote by Kosovar Albanians from Serbia was legitimate, was the recognition that it's kind of complicated, but that the Albanians that lived in Kosovo, which was a part of Serbia at the time, were a distinct peoples, like we saw on that last slide, but that also they were a distinct peoples from Albanians that lived in Albania. And so it becomes an interesting conversation when you're talking about Karabakh, because one of the reasons this was seen as legitimate was because these Albanians that were Kosovar Albanians could form an independent Kosovo that was a completely new and separate state. But what it wasn't going to be Kosovar Albanians just joining Albania. And so that idea of remedial secession was that this was such a distinct group of people that they would become a separate state completely. So that's just something to think about when we often look at Kosovo as a good example of a successful secession movement, but there is that little caveat there that the International Court of Justice posed on it. Okay, how am I doing on time? So the last thing I'm going to kind of get into is, based on the fact that the UN probably won't be that successful in resolving this, what are the other ways that we possibly could look at remedying this situation? In international relations, we look at 3 different levels. We look at the international system, we look at state, we look at individuals. And so when we think about what's, the kinds of things we would want to look at, it's first and foremost, how is power distributed? Who are the power players, right? And so in this situation, we would want to look and try to determine probably regionally who had the power, because that's going to be our point of being able to exact change, to put pressure, is to figure out, and also to recognize that there's a vie for power in that region. And so, they are, if we look at it, we just say, okay, it's Turkey and Russia. They are vying for power in a kind of a regional balance of power right now. And so we have to take that into consideration when we're thinking about how we could resolve this. We might also look at the state domestic incentives or constraints, right? So is Turkey engaged in maybe a diversionary war? What are the resources that are at stake? What are the economic situations of these states that are maybe leading them to support a conflict or not support a conflict or something like that? And then we would look at the individual elite decision makers. We would look at those actual leaders and try to figure out why are they making the decisions they're making, and where, again, are there ways that we can incentivize or disincentivize behavior, okay? I brought up the Minsk group earlier. And so this is something that a European international organization called the OSCE established. And they established this Minsk group specifically to deal with trying to create a permanent lasting peace with the situation. And so this is, it's under the leadership of France, the US, and Russia. They are set up to chair it. And they haven't been particularly successful. And in part, I would make the argument, and this is probably not a big surprise if you're familiar with the situation, but Russia has conflicts of interest, right? So if we go back up here to looking at state domestic constraints or incentives, right? Russia is supposed to be mediating this conflict and leading these talks and stuff, but it has a built-in conflict of interest because of its relationships, for instance, with Armenia and its relationships with Turkey and stuff. So we have to think through kind of whether that's an effective way to resolve the conflict. We also then could see states impose unilateral sanctions. So again, these would probably most likely be economic sanctions where you would limit the trade that countries could do. And again, this could be, individual countries or blocks of countries. So we could see, for instance, France or Germany impose sanctions, or you could see the European Union. And based on just a very cursory overview, looking at the, economic imports of Turkey, of Azerbaijan, we know that there are ways that you could apply pressure from an economic standpoint to try to change behavior, okay? The downside of applying sanctions is that it can open up ties to other countries, right? So if the European Union, for instance, was to kind of pressure Turkey in an economic sense, it's possible that Turkey could turn around and draw closer ties to another country, potentially Russia. I don't see that happening because of conflicts that they're having, but you have to think this stuff through, right? If you pressure Turkey or another country on their economy, then they're going to look for other economic opportunities, and that could be a detriment. All right. We could look at another organization like NATO. I mentioned that the OSCE was already dealing with this, but we run into a situation where neither Armenia nor Azerbaijan are partners. I mean, are members. They're just partners, but they're not members. So they don't fall into the same realm as a full member of NATO. NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and it's a collective security group of countries where it's the basic premise of it is an attack on one is going to be defended by all. Well, in this situation, neither Armenia nor Azerbaijan are members of NATO, so they don't fall under that kind of collective security arrangement. It also then doesn't have a formal role in mediating the conflict. But again, going back to points of pressure, Turkey is a member. And so NATO could pressure Turkey as a member to change its behavior, okay? And I just put an example there of how this works, right? Canada halted some weapon sales to Turkey after it was discovered that it was being used in Azerbaijan, right? So individual member states might do it. NATO is probably not likely to overall push back on Turkey, again, because it's the kind of conduit between Europe and the Middle East and parts of Asia, right? So you have to think through the realistic nature of some of these solutions based on kind of the geopolitical dynamic too. I'm sorry if I'm getting kind of using technical jargon. I don't mean to be doing that. Okay, and then the last thing is just some other remedies that we could think about. So you could use another piece of international law to bring a case of prosecution. So for instance, the United Nations has a mercenary convention that prohibits the use of mercenaries by members that have ratified it. So Azerbaijan has ratified this. So if you could demonstrate that there was the use of mercenaries, that would be an applicable tool. Russia hasn't signed it, not surprisingly. Turkey hasn't signed it. The United States hasn't signed it. So there's a relatively small group of countries that have, but international law says they have an obligation if they've ratified this treaty. Then there could also be appeals to regional organizations. So the Collective Security Treaty Organization is kind of Russia's answer to NATO. And so Armenia is a member, but Azerbaijan pulled out. So that creates some complexity, but it's also a potential regional apparatus that could deal with it. Again, Russia's a part of it, so they have different motives. So I don't know if it would be that particularly effective. The last three are just general international relations strategies we always think about. So the first is the use of public diplomacy. And this is really where the use of diplomacy is aimed not at the officials, but it's aimed at the publics. It's aimed at the domestic audience to try to then apply pressure. And so this is something that we see done where there's messaging to publics to then kind of try to pressure their governments to change their behavior. There could be messaging to publics in third-party countries that then applies pressure like sanctions and stuff. So it's really trying to go around the formal diplomatic typical use of diplomacy, which is state level to state level in terms of the governments, and go directly to the people. And then this is something that's newer, which is, I think it is smarter, which is the use of sanctions came really under heavy fire, especially in the 90s and the early 2000s, when there was just blanket general sanctions. Because what you see with economic sanctions that are just blanketly applied to a country is that they have a much more disproportionate impact on poor people. And so you see food shortages, but the elite are still fine, right? And so what smart sanctions do is they target specific individuals, elites. This could be presidents, foreign ministers, whatever, oligarchs, and it targets them specifically. And the idea is to turn the screws on them to get them to change their policy. And these have actually been very effective. You freeze bank accounts, you freeze their money in the United States, because many of these people have their money in the United States because it's a safe banking system. And so there's a lot of money laundering that goes on through real estate transactions, shell companies, but that money ultimately ends up in bank accounts in the United States. And because it's safe there, but it can also be frozen. And so this is a very effective technique. Like I said, you kind of put the screws to the leaders by holding their money hostage. And so stuff like that's really tailored, and it doesn't have the detrimental effect on the people who in many cases don't have a say in what their government is doing. And then the last thing, which I think this is really interesting because we've seen this recently in Los Angeles, which is the mass public, which is not the elites, but the people themselves applying pressure. And we've seen that with the diaspora. You know, we just saw this in Los Angeles with these massive protests that has the ability in some cases to kind of apply pressure here domestically to get them to maybe take some action on this, you know, on behalf of the Armenian community. So there's different remedies, and you have to do, you know, kind of case by case, try to determine what would work. But ultimately, it's trying to figure out where is that like point of leverage or that point of pressure you can apply, keeping in mind the way power is distributed and the interests of the individual states and decision makers. So, okay, I'm going to stop there and kind of open it up to questions or comments or whatever. Let me stop my screen, sorry.
You guys can all go ahead and just type in your questions in the chat privately to me, and then I'll just read them out to Professor Hastings.
And Levon.
And
Dr.
Levon,
Marashlian is here as well.
Professor Levon. Yeah.
There's no questions? Wonderful, there's no questions?
Oh, there is a question actually.
Okay.
It's why is Armenia not getting help from Kurdistan, Kurds?
Oh, Dr. Marashlian, you take it. You're muted. There you go.
Okay. First of all, it's a good question. First of all, there is no Kurdistan as a country, as an independent country. But clearly, Kurds are very sympathetic to Armenia and to Armenians, even though they had a participation in a genocide in the Ottoman Empire. But since then, a very close relationship. They have sympathy. But as Cameron pointed out, Kurdistan is not a recognized independent state. And there's some talk about individual fighters going over there, but that's the answer. Kurdistan as a state cannot do much other than sympathy. And also Kurds have a situation, the majority of Kurds are citizens of Turkey, about 15, 20 million over there. And if they try to act, if the Kurds in the area of northern Iraq try to help Armenia, then Turkey could punish their Kurdish citizens who are already being punished inside Turkey.
Another question we have is, can America take action?
So I don't know if you want to take this. I've been pondering this. Of course they could take action, right? But if we go back to incentives and disincentives, there's a lot of downside for the United States, and I don't mean that to be that it's not worth it. What I mean is, so we call, one of the things we talk about is spheres of influence, which is where does a world power have kind of their sphere of influence? And the region we're talking about in the South Caucasus, that is Russian sphere of influence. And so for the United States to decide to act, right, it would be really taking on Russia in their backyard. And I think the other thing is that right now we have an administration that has close ties to Erdogan, the president of Turkey. And so that puts, that kind of complicates any kind of foreign policy that we would have in the United States because of the personal, whether it's economic or some kind of tie where there's a close personal connection between Erdogan in Turkey and Donald Trump. That is going to probably prevent foreign policy from actively going in and trying to do something about this. It's easier to just sit back and let Russia deal with it, especially if there's a disadvantage or a drawback for the president in terms of damaging his relationship with Turkey. and future business dealings, to be honest.
Another question is, what do you think the European Union or NATO should do specifically about Turkey and its transfer of jihadists to Nagorno-Karabakh region to fight on behalf of Azerbaijani armed forces?
Levon, you want to take it?
It's.
I mean, let me start with the first part of it, which is what the EU should do.
Yes.
I mean, I think that the EU would be wise to consider some form of low-level sanctions to begin with. I mean, you don't ratchet it up and all of a sudden cut off all the trade to Turkey, right? But you identify vulnerable parts of their economy and you put pressure there, right? They have a lot of economic interactions with the European Union in general, but primarily Germany and France. And so if there are sectors that you can apply pressure to, that Turkey doesn't have alternatives to find other trade opportunities, that's where you start to see movement, right? NATO is not going to kick Turkey out. As bad as Turkey is behaving right now, they're not going to kick them out because, again, you create a position where now your geopolitical location of Turkey as the kind of hop-on spot down to the Middle East is gone. And you run the risk of them turning and aligning themselves against NATO's interests. And so that's not going to happen. But there are tools like economic pressure that can be applied. And you start small and you see where the leverage is that you get them to change their behavior. At some point, there's diminishing returns for Turkey to do this, but it has to be, you know, the EU has to figure out where that point is.
So another question we have is, what do you think the outcome of this conflict will be? And will there be any diplomatic efforts made in the next few months to help?
You answer that.
Yeah. Well, how does anyone answer that? Right now, the situation on the ground is very dire, and there seems to be no pressure enough yet on Turkey or Azerbaijan, not enough pressure. And it looks like the intent seems to be to continue, knowing that ultimately the Armenian forces are putting up a great fight, outnumbered and so forth. But ultimately, Baku and Ankara, they know that ultimately, unless resupplied, Armenians will run out of weapons, armaments. Azerbaijan is being resupplied constantly, and Armenia, as far as I know, has not been resupplied on a large level. Even humanitarian aid that tried to fly over Turkey was denied airspace. So they could just wear down. At this point, the Armenian side is succeeding in holding their own line, but how long can they put out? Can they last if they run out of ammunition? So Turkey and Azerbaijan are hoping that the world does nothing, and ultimately they could win. As Cameron pointed out, there are things the international community can do, and the only bright side is that there seems to be increasing willingness. The criticism has become stronger, and that is a positive sign. And Europe, you mentioned the European Union. Europe and other countries have to think long term. If Turkey gets away with this, the world could be in big trouble, because President Erdogan intends to recreate some form of the old Ottoman Empire. He has a dream of having Turkey become a global power. Turkey is a strong regional power to become a global power. And it could be a threat globally to the US. Turkey is involved in Libya and on. We can name a lot. So there's an expansive mood in Turkey. And if this is allowed to stand with Armenia, with Karabakh, with Artsakh, then Turkey becomes more emboldened. And in the future, the world may regret allowing this to grow to a point where their own direct interests could be threatened. And at that point, it may be too late. maybe too late. The world has the power to do something about it now. What will happen 5 years from now? Turkey is very ambitious. And one goal is to take the southern part of that region we're talking about, Nagorno-Karabakh, the southern part, and to take a small strip of territory of Armenia, which borders on Iran. That seems to be their goal, to take that part of Armenia, which borders on Iran, which would allow Azerbaijan to connect with a place called Nakhichevan, which actually is part of Azerbaijan, and then there'd be a direct connection with Turkey. Turkey would then have a direct connection across there, across the Caspian, all the way to China. And that's a long-term, it's called pan-Turkism. It's an established long-term goal going back to the early 20th century. And China will have to think about this very carefully too. So I don't know, it's a good question, hard to answer.
Thank you for that, Professor. If we have time, we have one more question. It's, would the continuation of the concept of self-determination be the best choice for Armenia-Karabakh side, or are there more realistic and possibly effective laws or concepts available?
I don't, yeah.
I mean, unless, my sense is unless there's more external recognition, it's an uphill climb. I mean, it makes it very difficult if you don't really have any formal recognition from other countries. I mean, I gave the example of Kosovo, and one of the things that helped Kosovo was that they did have other international the states recognize them. Russia doesn't, right? Obviously, there's countries that don't, but that's like almost the most critical element of it, right? Because it legitimizes the independence. Without that, it's hard, right? And unfortunately, without that, I feel like it's a stalemate, and it becomes just what we call a frozen conflict, which is mean there's no movement on it.
And Russia here has out of all the countries in the world, Russia has the most direct physical involvement. Russia has a military base, several thousand soldiers, long-term military base in Armenia. And as Cameron pointed out, this is Russia's backyard. If Putin allows this, Turkey and Azerbaijan to succeed here, Putin himself will be so weakened, and other countries in that security arrangement may feel like, well, what good is it being an ally of Russia if Russia will not help Armenia? What is this security arrangement we have? What value does it have for us? That could be lead to the eventual decline of Russia, which some countries would like to see that, the decline of Russia. So for Russia, they have the immediate physical capability of getting involved militarily directly. No other country does. And it looks like Russia is slowly moving in that direction if you pay attention to the rhetoric coming out of Moscow. In other words, it's self-interest, not just for Armenia, it's self-interest.
Yeah, and I think to build on that, it goes back to regional power, right? It goes back to, if they don't do something about this and it looks like they're incapable of solving this, then it has the potential of doing two things. I think it has the potential to embolden Turkey, obviously, but I also think it has the potential for a country like Armenia to say, well, if Russia's not going to help me, then I'm going to look to the West because I'm not getting help from Russia. And so it also has the potential for, and also, we're not just talking about, you know, the perception of Armenia. We're also talking about other former Soviet states. You can look at the Baltic region, and those countries say, well, heck, I mean, Russia's not doing anything right on their back door to help those countries. What we're going to make sure that we're aligned with Western Europe, because if we see a rising Turkey or a threat that's Russia's not going to save us. We need to align ourselves more closely. So I think there's a built-in incentive for them to deal with it sooner rather than later, because it also could send a signal to some of their former Soviet republics that they're not going to be, it's not good to align themselves with Russia, because it's not going to save them in case there's some kind of aggression.
There are two more questions, professors, if you guys are okay with me asking those.
Sure.
The first one is, what about the US Humanitarian Act? Turkey closed airway to the humanitarian aid to Armenia, and why are they not doing anything about that issue?
That question.
I'm not sure offhand.
He
I
asked
don't know. I mean, I know that the House of Representatives passed a resolution that was highly critical of primarily Azerbaijan. But again, just the way that our system works in terms of really, getting the United States to move is that you've got to have, obviously both chambers of Congress and an administration that directs foreign policy be willing to do something. They're going to run what we call a very rational cost benefit analysis, which is to say, what are the costs of getting involved in this and what are the benefits of it? And if there's not a very clear benefit, then and we're, as Americans right now, we have had a very isolationist foreign policy over the last 4 years. And so if there's not an overt benefit to doing it, we're probably not going to do it. Even if there's some kind of, compelled obligation that we have, we're not going to do it. We drag our feet.
The last question. Is it possible for modern Armenia to legally declare itself as a successor of the First Armenian Republic?
That's for you, Levan.
What do you mean? Armenia already is a republic. I'm not sure what that question is. Armenia already is a republic. I'm not sure what that. Armenia is a republic today.
They're asking in regards to inheriting the original land, including Artsakh.
Well, that's the whole issue. That can be done. It gets very involved now. But according to the way Artsakh declared independence, was relying on Soviet law. There's some legitimacy in the way they did it. There's no time to get into it. But Azerbaijan was independent 1918 to 1920. Armenia was independent 1918 to 1920. The two countries contested over Nagorno-Karabakh, but Armenia controlled it. So for 2 years, Azerbaijan did not control this region. So when they became Sovietized, first Azerbaijan became Sovietized April 2020. Armenia became Sovietized December 1920. And during that time, that roughly 6 months, Armenia controlled Artsakh. But that becomes very complicated.
Okay. Just an announcement, everybody. I just sent the link to the survey, and this is also for GCC faculty and staff, and we're going to be collecting flex information. So thank you so much for everybody for engaging with us tonight, and thank you again to Dr. Cameron Hastings. We really appreciate it, and Professor Marshallian.
Now I want to say what a wonderful, Professor Hastings did a wonderful job.
Yes,
great.
Thank you so much. I can safely say that the presentation was very effective in showing the relations and why it has led up to the current war. If you have any feedback, please, the survey that I sent, if you guys can complete it. We will be ending this meeting now. Thank you so much again for joining us, and have a great rest of your evening. Thank you, everyone.